think the general idea, it's your life, you get to run it the way you want to, is an appealing aspect of libertarianism.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with the Executive Vice President of the Cato Institute, David Boaz, a longtime libertarian activist and premier thinker. David, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.
The exact event that we're dealing with here is the Libertarian Mind. It's a revised and updated edition of Libertarian as a Primer, a book I reviewed for Reason in '97. And I am happy to say, maybe it's why I'm here, I gave it a rave review. It's subtitled now A Manifesto for Freedom. So let's talk about the Libertarian Mind. Talk a bit about how you define libertarianism in the book.
In the very first line of the new book, I say libertarianism is the philosophy of freedom. So that's the easiest thing. The sentence that I developed when I was talking about this book on the radio many years ago was, libertarianism is the idea that adult individuals have the right and the responsibility to make the important decisions about their own lives. And then, of course, I go on in the book to say, well, what does this mean? It means economic freedom and civil liberties, and I think a non-interventionist foreign policy. It means the protection of individual rights through limited government.
Yeah, and I mean, the idea of limiting the government is to give more space to individuals to kind of experiment or innovate or come up with the way they want to live their lives. And you stress this throughout, calling on various thinkers from the past, as long as they're not infringing on the equal rights of others.
Right.
One shorthand that gets used a lot for libertarianism, and I think it comes up in various kind of iterations and deviations in your book, is also, that libertarians tend to be socially liberal and fiscally conservative. What is the truth in that, and what's the limitation of that popular understanding?
I say that a lot when I'm talking to journalists or when I'm talking politics. As you know, David Kirby and I...
So this is when you're talking to very stupid people. Okay. Journalists and politicians.
As you know, David Kirby and I did several studies on the libertarian vote. And obviously there, we're not talking about people who read Reason magazine every month or have read my book. We're talking about, we think, tens of millions of people who are basically socially liberal and fiscally conservative. And I think what's important about that politically is that it sets them apart from the red base of the Republican Party and the blue base of the Democratic Party. And therefore, if people know I'm fiscally conservative and socially liberal, or some of my colleagues prefer to say socially tolerant,
right,
then you should know that you're not a fully comfortable Republican or Democrat, and that means you should be open to thinking of yourself as independent and maybe even grasping that you're kind of libertarian.
And this is also a way of stressing that libertarianism is really a pre-political designation, don't you think? I mean, there's a Libertarian Party, which is important, and we can talk about that, but a small L libertarian, it can inform your vote, but it exists before kind of a partisan tag.
Oh yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Libertarianism is a philosophy, it's an attitude or a sense of life. It may be just sort of a sense of life that I can make better decisions for myself than other people can. It may be a more developed political philosophy, even to the extent everything the government does seems to screw up, so why don't we have less government? Or it can be a more fully developed political philosophy. But in any of those cases, it doesn't necessarily tell you to get involved in politics or how to get involved in politics.
And one note on page 125, which I came across and in my reading, and this spoke to me too, is that you also stress that libertarianism it's a political philosophy. It's not, quote, a complete guide to life. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, libertarianism is about the relationship of the individual and the state. So it says what rights we have with respect to each other, and it says what rights we have with respect to the government and what powers the government should have. But beyond that, the famous communitarian philosopher said the language of rights is morally incomplete. Yeah, no kidding.
Right.
It's actually a very minimal set of rules. Don't hit other people and don't take their stuff. And then we build a legal system around those very simple rules. But it doesn't tell you how to treat your spouse or how to treat your friends or how to treat your employees. I know there are businessmen who say, I apply libertarian insights in my business, and they may, and those may work for them. but there's nothing inherently libertarian. There's nothing libertarianism mandates about how you treat people other than not hitting them and taking their stuff.
But could a libertarian do that? Or do you really have to be, if you're a libertarian in your politics, do you have to be a libertarian in your personal life?
Well, I've known enough libertarians to know they don't have to treat other people nicely.
Right.
So I don't think it's very likely. You know, it's like you have to be a pretty doctrinaire libertarian if you just don't like gay people, but you still support gay rights. Similarly, if you are a real misanthrope and you want to treat people badly, and particularly treat them as if they were not autonomous individuals. Now, as a legal matter, you have to. But yes, you could say, I'm going to pay good wages, but I'm not going to give you a moment's peace if you work for me. That doesn't seem a likely thing that a person with libertarian sensibilities would do. But yeah, as a libertarian, I would say, if you want to make that offer to people, and people want to come and accept whatever salary you're offering for bad working conditions, but they have a right to do it.
You talk in the book, I mean, you identify with a natural rights or a natural law tradition, there, you know, versus consequentialism, utilitarianism, various other reasons. Talk a little bit about the natural right tradition and how that influences your libertarianism.
So natural rights to me means I hold this truth to be self-evident, that everybody has a right to live his own life the way he chooses, so long as he doesn't interfere with the equal rights of others. And I think that tradition can be traced back to Aristotle, Aquinas, Locke, Mill, Herbert Spencer, and into the 20th century. Even in the Austrian economists, though they're generally regarded as consequentialists, I think you see the notions of treating people as rights-bearing individuals. And then, in a more modern era, to Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard.
Right.
But I want people to understand this is not something invented in the late 20th century by Rand and Rothbard. It has a long history, but it is the idea that we have rights as individuals, and if we set up government, it's to protect those rights.
Right. And that a government, I mean, going back to the Declaration, you know, that a government that does not respect those rights actually deserves to be overthrown. Or legitimately,
at least we have the right to alter or abolish it.
Yeah, but you talk about how many of the things we consider a kind of libertarian core of belief, especially in rights in yourself or rights to act the way that you want, stem actually from a religious, kind of religious-based revolution in 17th century England. Talk a little bit about the Levelers and about the English Civil War and how, you know, libertarianism is widely considered a haven for atheists, but in fact you make an argument that much of what we consider libertarian thought really started in a religious-based civil war.
Well, and going back even before that, I think you can say that a lot of the fundamental ideas of libertarianism developed through the Judeo-Christian theory of the autonomous individual, the thinking individual, the natural law, the individual who gets to read the Bible and have a personal relationship with Jesus.
We all have a soul.
Right.
So we are
soul.
God's property in some sense, not each other's.
Well, that's right, and you can trace that back to give unto God what is God's and unto Caesar what is Caesar's, which establishes that there are things that are not Caesar's.
Right.
We may have to discuss what they are,
right.
But that establishes the government doesn't own your whole life. It doesn't own the whole world. And then when you get to the English Civil War, yes, a lot of ferment in the 17th century, dissatisfaction with the Stuarts, who were perceived as coming in and trying to change the traditional English constitution with the rights of Englishmen and arrogate more power into the monarchy, and people started objecting to that, and we got robust debates going on. And there were a group of people called the Levelers. Like most political labels, this was given to them by their opponents. All they wanted to do was level rights. They believed in equal freedom under law. They didn't believe in leveling society. There was, in fact, another group of people who called themselves the true levelers, and they really were. They were like socialists. Right. And other people called them the diggers because they went out and dug up the land of the aristocrats. But the Levelers were putting together a program based on their Christian faith originally, and the autonomy of every individual and the responsibility that every individual has to God, not to the king. The king is only there so long as he respects our rights. And so they talked about individualism, individual rights, religious freedom, because there were arguments going on there between the Catholic Church, Henry's Episcopal Church, and then people who actually wanted real Protestantism.
Yeah. And a freedom of conscience, a freedom to worship God as you saw fit.
That's right. And so those kinds of things merged with their political theory, their defense of property rights, their defense of manhood suffrage, to create what we could consider the first recognizably libertarian political platform.
Yeah. And of course it also harkens back even to a pre-Christian era with, I'm thinking of, and it's mentioned in the book, plays like Antigone and whatnot, which is all about a person who refuses to follow the mandates of the political leader because she is answering to a higher law.
That's right.
So, well, talk about what is the evidence for the fact that we're in a kind of libertarian moment or a libertarian era?
Well, we've tried to announce the libertarian moment several times, but we might be in better shape here. One of the things certainly is, in my view, one of the things that creates libertarian moments is government overreach. And people see government is getting too big and it isn't working very well. So you had a financial crisis. There's a big argument over what caused that. Was it rapacious, unfettered capitalism on Wall Street, or was it shaped by bad decisions of the Federal Reserve causing massive mistakes in the market? And to the extent that a significant number of people accepted that latter point, it's Federal Reserve and overregulation that caused it, that pushes people in a libertarian direction.
And certainly you were saying the overreach, I mean, whatever caused it, the correction of saying, okay, we're bailing out auto manufacturers was never popular. We're bailing out banks, not popular.
Yes, that's right. So in September of 2008, you have this crash start to happen, and you have the government respond really in a completely undeliberative, unelected way. My memory of that fall is every Monday morning, the head of the Fed, the Secretary of the Treasury, and the head of the New York Fed would announce what they did over the weekend to destroy the remains of the free enterprise system. And we just felt like, small government people felt like we were being slapped in the face every Monday morning with these announcements. And it was a very depressing time to be a libertarian or a small government person. And obviously, a president promising a big expanded view of government was about to get elected and then announced both a healthcare takeover and a huge, biggest spending bill in the history of the world. But the other thing that starts going on during this period is a pushback. Sales of Atlas Shrugged start soaring. Sales of The Road to Serfdom start soaring. Sales of the Cato Institute's Pocket Constitution. Our Pocket Constitution made the Washington Post bestseller list in October of 2008. So there's that pushback, and then the rise of the Tea Party, which, although not a libertarian movement exactly, was a libertarian force in American politics. It was against big government, big spending, big debt, healthcare takeover. Simultaneously, starting really on Election Day 2008, gay marriage is defeated in California, and Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and all the Republicans are against it, and it looks like, wow, just took a big hit. And then, over the coming year, judges and legislatures in more states start endorsing gay marriage. And you have a movement that happens, and it eventually, within 4 short years, gets so big that Barack Obama has a long, dark night of the soul and changes his mind, and now he's in favor of it. Simultaneously, you have a marijuana legalization movement that's been around for many years. I had a New York Times op-ed in 1988 on why we should end the drug war. But suddenly, around 2008, 2010, it starts actually winning a couple of elections. So all of those things, I think, are part of the libertarian moment. And then, you folks at Reason have stressed much more than I do, the cultural aspects of the libertarian moment. New technologies that are allowing people to make their own music, publish their own books, publish their own magazines, find their own cab drivers, all sorts of things that feel more libertarian and give more people the sense that they can make decisions in the marketplace that they weren't making before.
You know, in the work that you've done on kind of the electorate and polling data and whatnot, talk a bit about how swing voters, or not swing voters per se, but how the pool of independent voters, of unaffiliated voters, seems to be growing. And does that feed in to this sense that things are more up for grabs. People are less interested in being an old-style Republican or Democrat or even an old-style liberal or conservative.
There are a lot of political scientists who say there aren't really any independents, that if you push them, they admit, well, yeah, I always vote Republican, that sort of thing. But still, the number of people who say they're independents is growing, and that certainly shows increasing dissatisfaction with both parties, in particular the Democratic Party, which has always had a plurality of the electorate, losing that now to independents.
Right.
And what our work shows is that a large percentage of those independents are in fact libertarian in the sense that they are, shall we say, socially liberal and fiscally conservative. Now, some of them, and this is one reason you can't organize the independents, some people are independent and swing voters because they're socially conservative and fiscally liberal.
Right.
And we sometimes call them populist voters.
Right.
They're basically anti-libertarian on a range of things. On the other hand, they're very anti-establishment. They don't like the big boys in Washington. And so I think a candidate, maybe it's Ronald Reagan, maybe it's Rand Paul, a candidate who can appeal to that anti-establishment, anti-Washington ethos might pick up some of those people, even though ideologically you'd think he shouldn't.
Well, talk about a recent governor's race in Virginia, which the Democratic candidate was Terry McAuliffe, who's very closely tied to the Clintons, is kind of a standard Democratic liberal. Ken Cuccinelli, who had been Virginia's Attorney General, was a very kind of standard issue Republican, very socially conservative, but also pretty small government, at least in many of his proclamations. And then there was a Libertarian candidate, Robert Sarvis, who got, 8 or 9% of the vote?
I think he only got 7, but he had shown up 10 or 12 in the polls.
Yeah, he more than covered the gap, I believe, between them, although exit polls showed that he pulled more from McAuliffe than from Cuccinelli, which is fascinating. But, is this kind of a test case of where, if Cuccinelli or McAuliffe could have appealed to swing voters, they would have, Cuccinelli might have triumphed, or the margin of victory for McAuliffe would have been much bigger?
Well, sure. If either one of them could have picked up a substantial number of Sarvis's 7%, then he could have won a comfortable victory. Right. I do think what you had there was a really right-wing Republican and a really corrupt hustler liberal Democrat. And so it was kind of tailor-made for a third party to actually get some attention. And I know the Libertarian Party is thinking, boy, if we actually had some money, or if the media covered us, think what we could have gotten in a race with those two very flawed candidates. But yeah, I think Sarvis showed that there is this group of people who will even vote for a libertarian if they hear his name, and if you kind of had an essence of Republican, an essence of Democrat candidate, and a lot of people didn't like him.
There seems to be part of the kind of libertarian moment, or an ascendancy. I mean, there's certainly, I think in the first time in my life, people are seriously talking about a libertarian wing to the Republican Party. Where did that come from, and is that for real?
Well, I said to Rand Paul the other day, I keep reading these headlines about libertarian wing of the Republican Party, and I'm like, who is this wing? It's Rand Paul.
Yeah. Well, and maybe a couple of others.
And there's a couple of others, and I do think that the Tea Party and Rand Paul together have made people think, oh, there's some kind of libertarian wing. The election of Justin Amash and Thomas Massie, and to some extent the election of Mike Lee and even Ted Cruz, are perceived as being different from establishment conservatives, even though it's not clear they're actually libertarian, but they're at least very strongly free market and ticked off about the way the government is trying to run the economy. So there's that kind of libertarian wing. But it's also true, if you look at votes, take the Amash Amendment to restrain the NSA, it split both parties, got about 40% of both parties in its initial vote on the Hill. And so that suggests, well, there was a libertarian wing of the Republican Party, maybe even a libertarian wing of the Democratic Party. And what we haven't been talking about here is foreign policy. And I think 13 years of war has caused even a lot of Republicans to say, when is this ever going to end? Why are we doing this? And they're now saying, a majority, I think, of Republicans, this war was a mistake. So Rand Paul has been the person leading that effort, but there are other people starting to talk about, enough so that neocons are complaining about an isolationist wing in the Republican Party. And I mocked them in 2012 and said, the neocons said there was isolationist talk in the Republican debate. Excuse me, from the former U.S. Trade Representative John Huntsman, from the international businessman Mitt Romney. Who are these people who are isolationists? These are people who are saying, you know, maybe we're in enough wars and it's time to wind them down. So that's some change in thinking.
Well, talk about, where is the libertarian case or the libertarian appeal, do you think, the strongest? And foreign policy is certainly one of these. We have majorities of people saying now anyway that the invasion of Iraq was a mistake, that Afghanistan, it's not clear what it achieved or actually, and we're still there. I mean, we have 15,000 troops. Talk about why people, is there something beyond just kind of fatigue of failure?
Well, there are two fundamental things that go on in American understanding of foreign policy, I think. One is generally a lack of interest in running the rest of the world. We have these two big oceans. We don't have to get involved all over the world, and a lot of Americans are perfectly happy not to. We don't speak very many foreign languages, and that kind of plays into, we don't need to do that. But there's also this Scotch-Irish attitude that if anybody kicks us, we're going to kick back. And so when you see beheadings or the attack on 9/11 or anything like that, you get a very strong push among the American public to hit back. Now, the libertarian argument, of course, is if you weren't over in Iraq, then ISIS wouldn't be beheading Americans. So stay out of conflicts and you won't have to get into further conflicts. I think the
Do you buy that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, because it's I mean, in a broad sense, but then in local senses, it's not clear, if you're beheading freelance journalists covering the Syrian civil war.
Well, yes, that's right. But most of what goes on in the Middle East, I think, is, in the first place, there wouldn't be a broken Iraq if it weren't for our Iraq war. There might not be a Syrian civil war. Now, maybe it's a good thing that people want to get rid of Assad, but it wouldn't be drawing us in. And so, no, I don't think it would be the same thing. If we had not already been at war there, then you wouldn't have the same desire to go in and fight there. So that is an appealing aspect of libertarianism, but it does come up against this. We hit back when somebody hits us.
But then there's also in Washington, and it seems to me this is part of the pushback, there is also a military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower obviously famously named and warned against. But, because people all over this place and in many parts of the country that get a lot of defense dollars, like they don't really care about being overseas. They just want to make sure that the $500 or $600 billion a year that are the baseline defense budget doesn't get cut and in fact grows.
Well, and if all that the defense budget cost us was the $500 or $600 billion, then that would be better than going to war and costing us lives and entanglement. But it is more than that, and I think actually foreign policy is an area where libertarians have, the libertarian argument has more resonance with the people than it does with the elites. But because people tend not to vote on foreign policy issues, that means the elites get to run things. So you've got a liberal internationalist establishment in the Democratic Party and a neocon establishment in the Republican Party, and those two together, though they would have trouble winning an election or a referendum in the whole country, nevertheless control Washington.
And talk a little bit, I mean, libertarians don't shrink from an integrated world.
No, I think the whole term isolationism, there are a few Americans who are isolationists traditionally. Some people didn't like international trade, they didn't want to learn languages or go overseas, and they didn't want our troops overseas. So that's isolationism. And Pat Buchanan might be an example of that today. But libertarians are very much cosmopolitan. We want to trade. We want cultural interaction. We want to get books and ideas and people. We're open to liberal immigration rules. The one thing we want to minimize is political and military intervention in the rest of the world. So that's simply not isolationism, it's non-interventionism.
Right, right, and non-military interventionism. Right. Where are other places that you think the libertarian case or the libertarian appeal is at its strongest?
Well, I think clearly one of the strongest appeals is don't raise taxes. In fact, cut taxes. And it's disappointing to me that the taxpayer movement has never been more successful than it has been, because it is very hard to win with the general public an argument that we shouldn't do more for education, do more for health care, do more for transportation. Where you can win is it's going to cost money. So we shouldn't tax more and we shouldn't go into more debt. Those two things, no debt and low taxes, I think are very strongly resonant with the public.
One of the problems, though, is that if you keep cutting taxes but you don't cut spending, you get into a very bad situation. And it seems that politicians have learned that you can actually cut taxes and keep spending more and more. I mean, this is the lesson of the George Bush presidency.
Or the lesson of the Reagan presidency,
yeah, that's
arguably.
right. Yeah. Actually, the lesson of all presidencies since probably Eisenhower.
Well, that's right, and I think among libertarian scholars there's a lot of argument over this. Should you starve the beast, or does cutting taxes without cutting spending lead people to say, hey, spending is free?
Right.
I think
which we hear about now. I mean, Paul Krugman, for instance, says we would be idiots given the interest rates are so low. We should be taking on as much debt as we can because it's never going to be this cheap again.
Well, that again, I think, is an elite argument that appeals to Democratic spenders but does not have much resonance with the American public. I think no debt and low taxes have much stronger popular appeal. And we argue about what is the practical impact. I still pretty much come down on Milton Friedman's side, that you want to cut taxes and cut spending whenever you get the opportunity. Yeah. But I appreciate that James Buchanan and Bill Niskanen are very smart advocates of limited government, and they had a different view of this.
I mean, they would argue actually that, when you raise taxes, or they claim anyway, or show that you raise taxes and spending will actually go down because people suddenly realize what they're paying for and they want less.
There were arguments about that, and my sense is that Bill Niskanen sort of changed his mind on that. He did not believe this idea of a grand bargain, raise taxes and cut spending, was going to work, although he had at an earlier point.
What else is there? Are there other? So we're foreign policy, taxes. What else is another big appeal for libertarianism right now?
Well, I think the general idea, it's your life, you get to run it the way you want to, is an appealing aspect of libertarianism. Unfortunately, in political terms, many voters are susceptible to saying that in principle, but then upon being told that what some other person wants to do is smoke marijuana or engage in a homosexual relationship or worship the wrong God in different periods of American history, people have reacted against that. And liberals, modern American-style liberals, not us classical liberals, will tend to say, sure, people should be able to make their own decisions. Oh, but not if that means not contributing to the public good by paying 50% income taxes.
Or not selling cakes to gay people, or not selling cakes to homophobes, right? Homophobes. So
well, that's right.
It can be, or if you start saying the wrong thing. So where do you think the libertarian case or libertarian appeal is the weakest? Where are places that still, large numbers of people need convincing that libertarianism is a smart way to think about the world, or we might persuade them?
Well, you're talking about Americans, right?
Yeah.
Because in a whole lot of the world, the idea of religious freedom is still a problem.
Yeah, right.
In America, I think probably the drug war is still something that, even though we're starting to win a couple of votes on marijuana, we're a long way from persuading people that other drugs should be legal. And that's an issue libertarians have talked a lot about. It probably is associated with libertarians in the minds of reasonably informed people. So that's been a challenge for us, although it's one we have talked about.
What about immigration? Because this is something, and I know a smattering of libertarians who are kind of anti-immigration, for various reasons, but overwhelmingly libertarians, we believe in the flow of goods and services across borders, and we believe in the free movement of people. That seems to be a radically unpopular point of view in contemporary America.
I don't think it's radically unpopular. I think if you look at the polls, most people are reasonably sympathetic to a moderately liberal immigration policy. They believe immigration is good for America. They believe that we should be open to immigration. They believe we should control our borders and control the flow, but they're generally pro-immigration. However, there are a significant number of people who we would generally regard as being pro-free market and anti-big government, anti-federal government, who are vociferously anti-immigration. And so yes, in terms of sort of putting together a political majority, yeah, there are people who don't like immigration.
What do you think drives the anti-immigrant sentiment, particularly among kind of conservative Republicans? They seem to be the most vocal.
Well, you know, to some extent, conservative reaction. That's what it is. Change. People don't like change. My Scotch-Irish ancestors came to this country before the Declaration of Independence, and I'm sure along the way they didn't like the Germans, and they didn't like the Irish, and they didn't like the Jews and Italians, and now they don't like the Hispanics. There's a zero-sum economics attitude that they will come in and take our jobs, which is a misunderstanding of the way the economy works. There is clearly some element of simply opposition to difference, racial difference.
It's a tribalism or racism.
Yes, there is that. And there is also, going along with it, a somewhat legitimate attitude about rule of law. These people are here illegally. My ancestors or my cousins waited in line. Now, I always say to the anti-immigration people like Pat Buchanan, you know, when your ancestors came in the 19th century, my ancestors were sitting here waiting for them, and they grumbled about it, but there were no restrictions. You were allowed to come in. So when you say your ancestors were legal, they were only legal because there were no barriers.
Right.
So what would your ancestors do if Ireland was suffering a potato famine and America had restrictions on immigration? They might just come in anyway. But it's a legitimate concern that things should happen according to the law.
But then there always seems to be the unwillingness to say, and therefore if we change the laws and allow more people to migrate legally, the problem of illegal immigration.
Lead them to say, why don't we change the law?
Yeah. Talk a little bit about kind of global warming.
I want to finish answering your question about what's most difficult, because one of the very difficult things for us to sell to a whole lot of people is the idea that specific things the government will do for you are a bad idea. That the government, in fact, doesn't run good schools, it doesn't run good health care, it's not even the best way to build roads and bridges. And all of these things together will be built inefficiently, and they will cost a lot of money, and the stuff you think is free will end up costing you more than you would have paid for it in the marketplace. So just the general idea of government as Santa Claus is a real obstacle to a libertarian or any other small government, fiscally conservative politics.
How much, and I think some libertarians flatter themselves to say, well, you know, the difference is that we think systematically and other people just aren't that evolved. But how much of it is constantly linking? I mean, I know tons of people with, you know, many degrees and all of this who will say, well, look, the reason, you know, I don't think the government should be doing that, but I get a National Science Foundation grant, and the government should definitely be funding that. I mean, is it one of the ways that we persuade more people to the efficacy or the effectiveness or the goodness of libertarianism is by kind of trying to create more systemic thinkers or more systematic thinkers?
Well, yes, it's probably good if people are more systematic thinkers. On the other hand, there are plenty of PhDs. Paul Krugman won a Nobel Prize in economics, and yet he doesn't agree with us on very much. So we can't just say if people were smarter and could think better. It's still probably good for the world if people can think more logically, but it's not an automatic ticket to winning. One of the things you point out, though, is that each new government program creates a new constituency. So the National Science Foundation grants, or the child care subsidies, or the highway for your district, all of those things create people who were not previously advocates of big government, but now are required to rally around to defend the farm subsidies or whatever. So one of the reasons that we so very much want to stop these new programs is each one creates a new constituency.
And which then, in order to get its concentrated benefit, is willing to add pennies to its tax bill to pay for everybody else.
Yes.
We'll talk about global warming, or global warming and environmentalism. This seems to be a case where I think there are very strong libertarian arguments about ways forward, but it often comes up as one of the places where, well, this is where, libertarianism has, no way of solving this, or even acknowledging that, collective action is needed to stop the planet from boiling in its own juices. What is the libertarian response to that?
Well, I think it's a difficult issue. I don't think that you solve that problem by saying, I have no systematic theory and no rules on what I think the government should do. Anything that looks good to me, I'm for. What is your political philosophy that defines what's appropriate for the government and what's not? Or is it that you think everything is the purview of the government? But for libertarians, yeah, it's an issue. As far as global warming goes, my own view, based on Pat Michael's work at Cato, we're the only think tank with an actual climatologist on the staff, is that the globe is warming. It's partly man-made, but it's not going to be catastrophic. The globe has warmed and cooled over the centuries and the millennia, and there's no evidence that it's going to be particularly dangerous. However, that doesn't mean that in theory it couldn't be, or that a hole in the ozone layer or something else like that could be devastating, and then you have public action problems. And yes, I think libertarians should think more carefully about what we would do if that were the case. And I don't know that I have a good answer other than decentralization, try to avoid command and control solutions. A strict respect for property rights typically gets you better answers and better internalization of costs.
And by that, it also, you're implying as well that, South Florida, which has had bad weather for a long time, does, in Holland, for that instance, they do a pretty good job of coping with environmental variance and catastrophe in a way that Bangladesh doesn't.
Well, that's right. So the most important thing to solving a lot of these problems, like the spread of Ebola in Africa or the threat of exaggerated hurricanes here, is wealth. Create more wealth. Our buildings are much less likely to fall down because we're a wealthy country and we value having buildings that don't fall down. In Bangladesh, they may value them, but they don't have the money. In Africa, in the countries affected by Ebola, they just have not created enough prosperity to be able to afford the medical infrastructure that would make Ebola easily manageable. So the answer to healthcare problems in Africa, to many of the world's environmental problems, is have a more prosperous world, create more wealth, which can then be spent on the real challenge.
What are the best ways to goose economic growth?
Well, we may be, because of demographic reasons or whatever, be in a period where growth can't be as high as it could have been. On the other hand, it was running at 3% before that. China's been running at 9%. They had a lot of catching up to do, but still, I'm betting we could do better than 3% if we had lower taxes, less regulation on the economy, less cronyism and protection for established businesses. Take Uber as an example. Here we have this 50-year-old taxi cartel in every city and every state, and a new business comes along and wants to break up that cartel and provide more service, better competition to people, and the cartel fights back. So breaking up cartels, from the taxis to the banks to whatever, is one way to do it, to open up the economy, get more entrepreneurship, get more things happening. But the burdens of taxes and regulation make that difficult.
How do you, and there are already instances where Uber is starting to form a new cartel. I mean, they're dealing in places like Washington, D.C. and whatnot, and it's an understandable business move. You show up in a city, you do pretty well, you get enough of a customer base so you can push back against the taxi commission, but then at some point you want to sue for peace, all right, and keep other people out. What is is that a just part of the free market? I mean, almost that big government and big business work hand in glove with each other.
Well, it's not part of the free market.
Okay, well,
it's part of the politicized market.
Let me put it, it's an excrescence of the free market, because once you have a wealthy business, you can start spending more money on things. One of the things you do is spend it on political favors.
Well, yes, except that if we had a more strictly applied Constitution, or had written the Constitution more strictly in the first place, and government wasn't allowed to create monopolies, for instance, then it wouldn't do you any good to to pay politicians to create a monopoly. So in a free market protected by law that actually guarantees a free market, then this would be less of a problem. In our current politicized market, then it is. I just read the Virginia legislature on a bipartisan basis is sitting down with Uber and Lyft to discuss rules to enable them to operate. And the first rule is they have to pay $100,000 for a license. Well, Uber can afford that. But there might be a lot of potential Ubers who can't afford $100,000. So yes, that absolutely looks like the established players, now including Uber and Lyft, will be able to get some barriers to entry created by the legislature.
What are the challenges? In talking about some of the places where libertarianism is appealing and somewhere it perhaps needs to do more work to persuade more people, there are also more serious challenges to the kind of libertarian paradigm, I think. And last year saw the publication in English of Thomas Piketty's book about capital, where he's basically saying that we are now entering a kind of, it's not even a new Gilded Age, but where it's just that the returns to the haves, it's just going to continue exponentially, where the have-nots are just locked out because individual laborers can't catch up to the returns on capital. Do you see that as a fundamental challenge to, or a credible challenge to a kind of libertarian free market perspective?
Well, I suppose it's a credible challenge. I'm not an economist, and I certainly am no expert on what's good or bad in Piketty's work. I do think, as a political matter, Piketty's book made an argument that was attractive to the world leading media. And so it was immediately hailed as the most important book of the decade and so on. And there were no critics because who's read it? It's 800 pages and it's a brand new book. And so the media report, he shows this. And then after the month-long media hype, economists start actually plowing their way through it. And my understanding is that they have come up with significant questions about the theory of the increasing returns to capital, serious questions about the actual data in the book, and so on. So 5 years from now, how influential will Piketty's book be? I don't know. But it made a big difference there. But yes, inequality and the perception of inequality is a big issue. One thing I think libertarians say, possibly isn't always compelling to people, is would you rather be equal at low incomes or unequal at higher incomes? Every day that Microsoft stock goes up, the gap between me and Bill Gates gets greater. But, I have a little Microsoft stock, so I make $10 that day. He makes $100 million that day, but I don't see that as bad for me. So in general, it seems to me the problem we ought to be concerned about is poverty and the stagnation of middle-class wages. So rather than focusing on we don't want Bill Gates to be rich or get richer, we should focus on what are we doing wrong that might improve the problem of poverty or middle-class incomes.
But now, is that really where the battle is being drawn? Because inequality, a lot of people react negatively to the idea of inequality. It does seem, it seems to be growing. The gap between the richest Americans and the poorest Americans, middle-class incomes seem to be stagnating. And what people, even when Obama was talking in his State of the Union address, he wasn't talking about, I'm going to go after those, malefactors of wealth that billionaires. It ends up attacking people who are in the top 10% or the top 20%. And does libertarian, so it's not that Bill Gates gets rich, but it's that somebody who's making twice or three times as much as me, who is basically, I have the same education, we started out at the same place. That seems to be where the rub comes, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure about that. It seems to me that what we hear about is billionaires, and billionaires are in a completely different place. Yes, there has been some stretching out of middle-class incomes. Charles Murray talks about how it used to be if you were good at math, you could become an engineer and make twice as much as the factory worker. But now if you're good at math, you can become a Wall Street quant and make 100 times what the factory worker does. That may seem unfair, but the economy, the market, is about satisfying human needs. And if it turns out that your skills, once not very useful, are now incredibly useful to making our economy work better and to provide more real wealth for people, then that's a good thing. I saw a chart of incomes from 1979 on by the various income classes the other day. What it shows was that the bottom 4 quintiles, all up roughly 40% in that period, top 20% up twice that much, top 1% up 1,000%. Okay, that is rising inequality, but it's also significant increases in living standards for all Americans. And that seems to me better than what I think would be the results of seriously trying to constrain inequality.
But then this is Obama talking to Joe the plumber, or even in the State of the Union. Well, why don't we just take some of that extra wealth at the top and spread it around a little bit more? That's fair.
Well, that's right, and it's easy to say that that's fair. And if you take a little bit extra from the billionaires, really, are they going to stop working? But as you were saying, it's not just the billionaires who will be hit by these taxes. It is the people who are currently working and building businesses, because you can't get that much from billionaires. And if you try to take a lot of what they have, then yes, they will stop creating companies and they will stop working. It's a bad thing for America and for the world that Bill Gates stopped working because he had enough money and went into philanthropy. He was brilliant at creating new connections and new wealth for society. It's too bad he's not doing that anymore.
I suspect many Microsoft employees would agree with you.
Yes.
That he should have kept working. Here's another possible challenge to a kind of libertarian paradigm, which is millennials. And I know that you've done some work on millennials. Reason has done a long poll, an in-depth poll. And millennials, on a certain level, are very libertarian. They hate things like nanny state rules. They hate soda bans, and they hate smoking bans, and they hate all, they want more choice in their lives. They don't have the same kind of sexual or racial hang-ups that older Americans have. I mean, they're very cosmopolitan, they're very loose, they're very free in that way. But they also believe that the government, a majority of them believe that the government should guarantee you health care, should guarantee you a job, should guarantee you lots of stuff. Is that mentality a standing challenge to a libertarian paradigm?
Oh, I think it is. My friends who run Students for Liberty and Emily Eakins, who does this polling work, keep trying to convince me that millennials are essentially libertarian. This is the most libertarian generation ever. And I look at
since
those
the
polls.
last one, right? Yeah.
But I look at those polls and I see that millennials seem to have an incredible faith in a government that I think they know has been a huge disappointment in a whole range of areas, and yet they want this magical government to provide jobs, provide housing, and so on. Now, one answer to that may be that when they get in the workforce and they start paying taxes, they'll have a different view of how much the government should do. On the other hand, millennials, I think, range up to age 29, so they're either in the workforce and they're paying taxes, or they're not in the workforce because our economic policies are not working, and so we may be in a period of trying to argue to this generation, what is it that isn't working? Is it the rapacious, untrammeled capitalism that isn't working? Or is it the burden of taxes and regulation? And of course, I think it is the burdens we're placing on the market that are causing so many young millennials to not be able to find jobs, to still be in their pajamas in their parents' house talking about the need for health care.
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting is libertarian thought and the political philosophy that it comes out of in the Enlightenment and in the 19th century is the belief that you and I and everybody is an autonomous individual who should be given wide latitude to make choices in their life, choices of who to vote for. They should be given the franchise, what to buy, what to wear, how to organize their lives. Yeah. And there's a lot of pushback now, or not maybe pushback, but there's a lot of investigation now, whether it's through evolutionary psychology or through even economics, which is saying, wait, hold on, because actually individuals are much more subject to forces that direct and control them that we didn't really pay attention to. And so you have people like Cass Sunstein talking about nudging people, or that creating a framework which will direct people to the right decision. You have people who follow advertising and say, look, and this is an old idea, but the hidden persuaders, and now we use a more scientific term, they're goading people to buying certain things, selling certain things. Even Nobel Prize winning economists like Vernon Smith, who's someone we both know, who is a phenomenal libertarian and a really interesting economist, his experimental economics really consistently shows, I mean, he'll say that I can take freshmen and teach them a couple of rules in an investment system, and within the second or third trial, they'll be doing exactly what the system tells them to do. Is this a kind of metaphysical challenge to the idea that, I would even say maybe somebody like Charles Murray says, look, some people just don't have the wherewithal to really make the best choices for their lives. Is the libertarian paradigm at risk from an attack for people who say, you know what, this idea that we're making meaningful choices is just a bunch of hooey?
Well, we may all be living in the Matrix, but the thing about the Matrix is you don't know that. So I am certainly not conversant enough with all of these schools of thought to have a rational opinion about it. I guess what I would say is society works best if we let people make decisions, whatever way they're making them. We will get better results if we act as if people have free will, if they have autonomy, if we hold them responsible for the consequences of their actions, even if there may be some unfairness because really they had something in their brains causing them to do this. And we should continue to study these things and maybe we'll find out something better. But I think we've learned from trying socialism and central planning and various and theocracy and various kinds of ways of actually regulating through force what choices people can make, that you get worse results. So do you get ideal results? Do you get perfect results from people making their own decisions? Maybe not, but I think you get better results than any other social political system will give you.
And I mean, this is an interesting point that you raised. Libertarianism is often accused of being utopian, but it really is profoundly anti-utopian because it's never talking about the one best way or the final breakthrough. It's really about a kind of process that allows people to discover, or society and individuals to discover what they want and what they should be.
Right. It's a discovery procedure. It's a framework for utopias. You can try to set up the way you'd like to live, and I can try to set up the way I'd like to live. And some of those ways will turn out to be more attractive to people than others. And, this idea that advertisers or anybody else can shape what we think, yeah, to some extent, but it's also true that sometimes there are big budget movies that fall flat on their faces. And there's the old story about, we've tried everything with our advertising and we still can't get people to buy the dog food. Why is that? And finally, the intern says, dogs don't like it.
Talk a little bit about what are the challenges to a kind of libertarian political movement or social movement that you find are profound or particularly challenging?
Well, there are a lot of challenges to our political movement. Right now there aren't enough of us and we don't have enough money. To the extent that we do have money, it tends to go all into economic issues, regulation and taxes, and not into broader parts of libertarianism. That may itself connect to one of the challenges we face is a lot of us grew up in a world where kind of seemed like everybody in America was white except 10% were black. And they didn't have a whole lot of involvement in shaping politics or public life.
And a lot of us are men as well.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
And now we're in a much more diverse world. Libertarianism has the image sometimes of being a white guy's club. And so we need to work on diversifying, to have more women, more people of color involved. And when we see that among younger groups, you definitely see a more diverse group at Students for Liberty than you do at an older donors conference. You see a very much more diverse group among Cato's interns than among Cato's middle-aged policy staff. So I think that is partly changing, but I think it's also that we need to think more about talking about issues of race and class and talking in ways that appeal beyond our logical Austrian Randian INTJ white guy syndrome.
Yeah. What is the you talk about this in the book both in terms of kind of feminism or gender equity as well as racial equity. What is the libertarian line on these things?
Well, the history is very good. Libertarians are the heirs of classical liberalism. And who was it who first, after thousands of years, challenged slavery? Some Christians, but mostly Christians influenced by liberal values. Who first said women are equal to men? Classical liberals, proto-libertarians. The same thing with gay rights. The only
Yeah.
people who challenged the general societal attitude toward homosexuality were classical liberals.
Yeah, and you point out that the Libertarian Party in 1972, as part of its platform, had gay rights in it, and I believe at that point it was homosexuality was still considered a mental illness in the DSM,
and a
whatever
crime
it
in
was.
many states.
Yeah.
So yes, so libertarians have been ahead of the game, up through slavery, Jim Crow,
and you
gay
point
rights.
out as well that there's kind of a founding matriarchy, really, of the post-war libertarian movement in terms of Ayn Rand, Isabel Patterson, and Rose Wilder Lane.
Yes.
But this is kind of like Rand Paul going to Howard and stopping his genealogy of greatness in about 1920 of how Republicans were good on race. So, what is the contemporary pitch to say to women and minorities that actually libertarian thought is the place that you should be looking at?
Well, I think to women, the pitch is absolutely we believe every individual, every adult individual is equal and everybody should have the opportunity to fulfill their dream, to pursue their dream as they choose, which might be being a homemaker and it might be being a CEO, and everybody gets to make that choice. And to the extent that there are some feminists who want the government to take care of women, whether that was traditionally by barring them from certain occupations, or these days by mandating them in certain occupations, or by guaranteeing child care or birth control or whatever, well, libertarians have to disagree with that. But individualism and equal dignity, we're there on. With Hispanics, we obviously talk a lot about liberal immigration rules. We also talk about this country being a land of opportunity, and let's make it more so, and let's have better schools, and those are the things that will help people rise. With the African-American community, I think we did sort of, for a generation, drop out of that battle, and libertarians need to get back in it. And what can we say to people in the African-American community? Well, the Cato Institute runs policemisconduct.net. We are the people monitoring police misconduct around the country. We are the people criticizing the drug war, which brings such a heavy military presence and criminal presence, prison presence into black communities. We're talking about giving poor people more options in schooling. And that would be so much of a benefit to poor people, which disproportionately includes African Americans.
Let's talk a little bit about your kind of personal odyssey to libertarianism. You hail originally from Western Kentucky.
I do.
You're Scots-Irish, so that means that family gatherings must be quite a combustible affair. And particularly if Kentucky bourbon is involved. But what's your intellectual genealogy? How did you start to become a libertarian? When did you start calling yourself that?
Well, my parents were both well-educated and conservative. I grew up sort of a Jeffersonian constitutional conservative. In my part of the country, we were still all Democrats back then, but Democrats who voted Republican a lot of the time. And so I got interested in these ideas, and I thought of myself as a conservative. I guess I wasn't a very rebellious kid at that time, and so my parents were conservative, and that's what I read. I read Henry Hazlitt, and I pretty well learned all the economics I was ever going to learn. You read economics in one lesson, and you got the lesson. I read Barry Goldwater's The Conscience of a Conservative, which is a very libertarian book, despite its title, and that gave me a framework for understanding public policy. And then actually, I read a couple of issues of...
Can I ask you, before we move off of Goldwater, how do you square his, or in Conscience of a Conservative, or I guess it was the later book, Why Not Victory, which was a brief for victory in Vietnam and elsewhere, a kind of massive anti-communism, which, makes a hell of a lot of sense, but there's a militaristic component to that, which Goldwater embraced, but not fully. I think he was always against the draft. But, how, were you more of a conventional conservative of we've got to go over there, we've got to be on the Korean Peninsula, we've got to be in Indochina, we've got to be everywhere where the bugs might show up and get them before they take over land.
At that time, I was pretty conventional conservative. As you know, it was pretty common for conservatives who thought that the federal government couldn't do anything competently except maybe deliver the mail, nevertheless thought it could have this massive military establishment throwing its weight around the world, confronting communism all over. When I was 14 years old, my first published article was a call for victory in Vietnam. So, yes,
and
I
on
bought
the
all
side
the
of the South Vietnamese, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, so you encounter Goldwater. You've read Henry Hazlitt, and then what starts happening that you pull into a libertarian?
I became a subscriber to New Guard, the magazine of Young Americans for Freedom, and there were
Young Americans for Freedom was the conservative student group,
right?
That
the
was founded by Bill Buckley,
Reagan Goldwater Buckley student conservative group, and so around 1970, I read a few issues and. They were really focusing on the conflict between freedom and order. They had radical libertarian writers and radically traditionalist writers. And I began to see, what I like about this conservatism is the emphasis on freedom. And so that pushed me in a libertarian direction. And then I read Ayn Rand, and that pretty well pushed me into the libertarian camp. But I still thought libertarians were sort of a kind of conservative. And so I got involved in Young Americans for Freedom. I became the editor of New Guard magazine.
Yeah, talk. What were the issues when were you editor, and what were the issues that were really hot in the moment?
Well, I was editor in the late 1970s, so the first and second Reagan presidential campaigns were certainly a shaping thing there. A hot issue, and opposing Jimmy Carter and his energy regulations. On the other hand, I actually, as a young conservative libertarian activist in Washington, worked with Jimmy Carter on resisting the draft until he switched sides, and on the deregulation of transportation. So I was able to say, this guy's good on this, but all this overweening energy regulation and so on, we're against. And, in a kind of partisan Republican way as well. We're just against Jimmy Carter. And I went to the Republican convention in 1976 as a Reagan advocate. 4 years later, I opposed Ronald Reagan because I was supporting the Libertarian Party candidate. So somewhere in there, I had made a transition.
What was the kind of Damascus Road experience where you realized libertarians are not a type of conservative, but a whole different species?
Well, I did some more reading. I read more Rand. I read some Rothbard. I ran into Ed Crane and Tom Palmer through the Libertarian Party and got beaten on by them to understand the contradictions within conservatism and began to feel more and more uncomfortable. YAF was always undergoing factional fights, and at one point I kind of ended up on the wrong side of a factional fight. And fortunately had become libertarian enough to get a job in the libertarian movement. So right there around 1979, I got my first job in the libertarian movement, and then I jumped ship to go work for the Ed Clark campaign and really learned how to write libertarian arguments on behalf of Ed Clark.
Well, and now Ed Clark in the 1980 presidential election, he scored, 1 million votes or 900,000?
900,000 votes, 1.1%.
Yeah, and so was by far the best showing a libertarian candidate had until recently when Gary Johnson did basically the same numbers, a little bit higher in terms of total votes, a little bit lower in percentage.
That's right.
But what was appealing to, 1 million people basically, or 1% of the voters in an election in 1980, because, there was Jimmy Carter, there was Ronald Reagan, there was John Anderson. What was it about Ed Clark that managed to, poll 1%?
Well, 1% is not much.
That's but relatively speaking, it's pretty good.
Yeah. Well, relatively speaking, I do think Clark came across as a serious, thoughtful guy, and he had a semi-professional campaign, which is probably better than the Libertarian Party's done in other years. But you have to say that one of the significant things he had was money from David Koch, who was his running mate, which was the only way a then multimillionaire, later billionaire, could actually give a lot of money to a presidential campaign. So Ed Clark was able to run, as I recall, 47 5-minute advertisements on primetime network television back when there were only 3 networks. And that has to be the explanation. But the message was the American tradition, individual liberty, individual rights, here is, and what the Republicans are doing wrong, what the Democrats are doing wrong. He could have gotten more votes if Ronald Reagan hadn't been a pretty libertarian rhetorician that year. And I think he would have gotten more votes if John Anderson hadn't been there, because Anderson was sort of a liberal Republican. He's not anti-business and anti-free enterprise, but he's not one of those moral majority types. And so I think he took a lot of the attention the third-party candidate could have gotten, and he took some of the votes of the socially liberal, fiscally conservative group.
Yeah, and the Clark Koch campaign, they were running on things like the abolition of the FBI and the CIA.
I don't remember
right?
specifically. Did we say that?
Okay.
We might have.
I think so.
We
but
certainly
I
ran
mean,
on,
well, it was
we had a list of a whole bunch of government programs we were going to
abolish.
abolish.
It was a wonderfully hardcore libertarian rescission of government roles and responsibilities, which seemed to be in keeping with, this was coming out of a decade where every day you would wake up to a new expose of just how awful the government had been, and not just simply in misdelivering the mail, but in surveilling people or running scams.
COINTELPRO and Watergate and Vietnam.
Yeah. Finally, let's talk about 2016. We've just come through a midterm election that was just short of a landslide for Republicans. They now control the House and the Senate, which means that they will probably reveal themselves to be utterly contemptible over the next 2 years. But in 2016, we have people like Rand Paul, who's clearly running or gunning for the Republican nomination. Do you think 2016 is going to be a libertarian year, or will libertarian issues be front and center?
I think there will be a lot of libertarian issues being talked about. I think endless war is an issue that certainly Rand Paul will talk about, and other candidates are going to have to respond to that. On the other hand, there may be conservative issues in the sense that if ISIS is still marauding in Iraq and Syria, then there's going to be a strong neocon argument that we got to go in and fight that. But yeah, I think war will be. I think NSA surveillance is still going to be an issue on the table that most of the Republicans would probably just as soon not deal with, and the Democrats too. But that if Rand Paul is running, which I'm pretty sure he will be, he'll be talking about. And then the general issues of the size of government. What should we do about inequality? What should we do about poverty? All of those have libertarian answers. And gay marriage may be off the table by then because the Supreme Court may take it off, and I don't think conservatives are going to respond the way they did to Roe v. Wade and go on a 40-year crusade to repeal it. This is not about the taking of life. This is about letting people get married. And I think after a year of letting people get married, Republicans will say, yeah, whatever. Marijuana might be a bigger issue, probably not a presidential level issue, because I don't think anybody's going to want to take it up. But I do think Rand Paul will be running, and I think he will talk about these kinds of issues, and he will get beat up by the establishment conservative media and all the other Republican candidates, and so it'll be interesting to see whether he can hold up to all of that.
Do you, the libertarian moment, extending it into a libertarian era or more than a blip, it doesn't really turn on whether or not he's the Republican nominee or not?
No, that's right. Historical trends are bigger than any one candidate. Now, I think we can look and see if Ronald Reagan had not been the Republican nominee in 1980, would things have been different? Probably so. So it does make a difference, but government programs will continue to falter. The economy will continue to struggle because of the burdens placed on it. We will continue to get ourselves involved in unnecessary wars. The president talked in his State of the Union speech about being dragged into unnecessary conflicts. Of course, he's bombed 7 countries and Bush only bombed 4, so he should know. But all of these things will continue to be problems, and if Rand Paul doesn't get elected president, people may decide, as they did with Ronald Reagan, boy, we made the wrong decision last time, we should vote for him next time, or other libertarian candidates will surely emerge.
We've been talking with David Boaz. He's the Executive Vice President of the Cato Institute and the author most recently of the new book, The Libertarian Mind, a revised and updated edition of Libertarian as a Primer. It's also subtitled A Manifesto for Freedom. David Boaz, thanks for talking.
Thank you.
For Reason TV, I'm Nick Gillespie.